Hello everyone, welcome to a presentation of Smoke 2013, the new release that came out at the end of May. My name is Rob O'Neill, I'm the Creative Finishing Specialist in Australia and New Zealand, and I'm going to take you through a tour of the new release for the next 20 minutes. So, the end of May we released what we call SP3, or Extension 1. It's not just a bug fix, though there were a lot of bugs fixed and a lot of enhancements or optimizations made to the software, but also a couple of new features added as well. Notably, the Blackmagic design support for their Decklink cards and Ultra Studio cards. So if you need to know more information about this, please contact your reseller. In the software we added new trim view functionality, and you'll actually see this in the demo in a minute. We took your feedback and built a new trim view based on what editors are used to in other nonlinear editing applications. As well as that, there was AAF and XML translation improvements, particularly related to the accuracy of time warps. Workflow improvements in Action, Connect Effects and the Media Hub, and basically we can say it's much faster. There was also ACES color management improvements. We've now got some color transforms related to broadcast monitors. And also enhanced support for the codecs from Red, Arri and the Sony f65 HDR cameras. So today you're going to have a look at a couple of jobs. The first one we're going to look at is a broadcast piece. It's from a broadcast station in the United States, in Indianapolis, called WTHR. And the editor there, Brian Mulligan, is a long-time Smoke user. In fact, he always regards Smoke as his weapon of choice. Brian edits from scratch. He also does the sound. He creates visual effects out of nothing. He'll use 2D and 3D objects in his promos, as well as getting some support from external applications, particularly with graphics supplied as PSDs and importing those directly. So let's have a look at this spot first, and then we'll break down a couple of the workflows that he uses in it.
No, first.
Okay, so this is the promo. Let's just bring up a little bit of sound.
The instant.
So as you can see, there's lots of graphics being used, lots of speed-ups, slow-mos, even the police lights were added in Smoke's lighting tool. PSD graphics and FBX models here, and lots of tracking of images inside iPhones and iPads. So this is the user interface. We've now got all the buttons that editors are used to insert, overwrite and replace media. All of those are there. Dragging clips from the bin on the left and dropping them directly onto the timeline. Instant access, we can mark in and out points and we can drag those across. We can also choose shots like this one, which are a completely different format and aspect ratio, and mix those into the timeline and directly from the viewing window and ripple insert that into the timeline, and the resize gets applied automatically so it matches the other shots perfectly. We can even grab multiple shots and drag them in order down onto the timeline. Trimming up to now was always like this. It was intuitive, but it wasn't what a lot of editors were used to. So you gave us feedback and we then created this. This is the new trim view. It allows you to gesturally manipulate cuts on the timeline or on the picture. You can fine-tune it by moving it frame by frame. And there's also a replay button on the right-hand side where you can test what you've just trimmed. Okay, now to the effects side of Smoke. This web page is going to be inserted into that laptop on the right. We're going to use a tool called the bilinear. Now this allows us to do 4-point tracking in the stabilizer directly on the timeline. So we're going to position these 4 trackers, but you'll notice when we get to the third one that there's really nothing to track onto. So we're going to estimate where it should be, and it will actually lock onto the weave of his shirt. Look at that. So that's done, and it really is that fast. Change the blend mode and then back to the timeline, and we copy the shot underneath above the composite, and we're going to roto his arm back in over the top of the comp. So we use a tool called Axis directly on the timeline, and it's got a keyer in it. Inside the keyer we're just using a garbage mask. We're going to plot a few points along the edge of his arm as accurately as we can, but we're not going to worry about anything away from the screen. Now we want these vertices to follow the camera movement, so we're going to select them and then go into the stabilizer again, and this time we get a tracker for each one of those vertices, up to 15 here. But we can have up to 1,000 tracking points, and you can see how easy that is. So let's just have a look at the mat, and we'll soften off the edge a little just to help the blend and render while we're in the module, so we can see if anything's wrong. Back on the timeline, it's all done. Okay, so that was a broadcast promo. What if we're dealing with something that's more filmic? So this piece we're about to show you is called Gwen and Dave. It's a short film. It was all rendered in 3D Studio Max, rendered as EXRs, open EXRs, 32-bit full float. And what we've done is imported them in. Now when we bring them in, they're scaled to 16-bit float. Now 16-bit float is as good as 32-bit. The difference is actually academic. So what we did here, we conformed the EXRs onto the timeline, and we composited them with all their various passes. So we're going to show you that workflow dealing with renders from CG. So inside Smoke, this is the timeline of our 1.5 minute piece. We're playing through it at the moment. You can see there's some audio tracks there and some animated graphics. Now, some of the animated graphics came from elsewhere, but this title here was all done inside Smoke. So a lot of the elements were rendered in 3D, but there were some that were augmented with effects within Smoke. So we're playing through the piece at the moment. You can see the audio tracks. Smoke can handle up to 32 audio tracks without mixing down, but we can actually handle an infinite number of tracks. So you need, if any more than 32, you need to mix it down. We've got all the EQ controls on the right-hand side as well. So it's an audio suite as well as an editor. And we'll get into the effects side in a minute. So Smoke is your one-stop shop for everything that you need to do in post-production, and especially at the finishing end of post-production, with our best-in-class tools, keying, color correction, tracking, compositing in a 3D environment. It's all built in here without having to go to other applications. So just as the piece is finishing off here, just to give you a look at it, even the credits can be done inside Smoke. So it's like one of those Danos commercials that you see at 2 AM that does everything in a few order now. Okay, so above the track on top here, we've got what we call a play blast. Now we can use this with a split screen directly on the timeline to check that our renders have actually come out correctly. And of course, if you're finished with that, you can then throw it away. So that's the editorial side. What about taking one of these shots and compositing it? So now we have an example of one of those clips where we've taken some of the render passes out of 3D Studio Max, and we're compositing them together and applying blend modes directly on the timeline, and also augmenting what was done in CG with some effects that can be easily added in Smoke without necessarily having to go back to 3D to have it rendered. So this shot here in the middle, inside the garage where he's lifting up the car. Let's navigate to where the media is. You can see there it is. They're all multi-track clips, so they're actually RGBAs. So when we drag it into the imports library over there, we tell Smoke that we want to bring in the alphas inside a Mac container. And that way, whatever we do with those clips, the alpha is always attached to it. So rather than building the comp directly on the main timeline here, we're starting off with an empty one. This is the way that most compositors or editors like to work. So we're going to drag from the back, so that scene, and then the room on top of that. Now the alpha is attached to this. I'm just dropping it onto the layer above. It's going to stack it vertically. Let's add a third track by right-clicking. And the third track is going to be an ambient occlusion pass for the room. And then we've got our characters above that, also an RGBA. And we've got a couple of other shots to be added, another ambient occlusion pass and a highlights pass for the lighting over the top of it. So 6 all included. Now I've just applied an axis effect to all of the layers simultaneously. Now if we just have a look at these, and let's go to the layer above, the third layer, and set the blend mode for our ambient occlusion pass. You can see what it's like with it on and off. There's our characters. Let's go to the ambient occlusion pass for them and do the same thing. It's always a multiply. And then a screen blend mode for the edge of the lighting. There you can see it's just a subtle thing, but it needs to be there. So there's that done. Now here's another one with an extra layer added on top where we've used Connect Effects. Now what I've done is brought the alpha from the windows in, and I'm actually shining a light with edge rays, the volumetric edge rays through that just to augment the lighting. So it's just there, and then render that, and you can see that that's now all done. Now the big advantage, of course, with dealing with OpenEXRs is that we can play around with the exposure values. It's not just color grading down on the timeline and take advantage of the HDR renders. Okay, that was dealing with rendered clips out of 3ds Max. Now, what if we wanted to deal with an actual 3D object with a mesh and textures and lights and, well, basically anything, including keyframes from any of the Entertainment Creation Suite products, including Softimage, and also some other suppliers like these ones listed here. So this is an example of something that came from 123D Catch. It was a series of photos. I think there was about 40 different photographs taken of this statue, and all around it, and then it was uploaded to the cloud and rendered as an FBX object. So what we're going to do is bring in this object here, and there it is. Now when we load an FBX, we can load everything, camera data as well, but this is just the model, and this is what you get. So these nodes represent various levels of control over the model. And you can see there it is there, it's all mapped correctly, and I can move my camera around in 3D space if I wanted to make this statue look taller. We can also play around with the materials like the transparency and the shininess. I've got control over that because I have a 3D environment. Now the texture map that came in from 123D Catch looks like this. It's a strange looking mosaic, but when it's imported into Smoke, Smoke knows exactly what to do with those pixels so that they map correctly onto every polygon. Now, why do we externalize this? Well, we might want to be able to color grade it or apply a paint effect or change it in some way before it gets applied to the model. And that's exactly what that allows us to do. And there's the final. I'll just play that back as it came in directly from 123D Catch after it was rendered in the cloud. Okay, let's take this one step further. So that was an inanimate object. What if we had an object like a games character or the animated dinosaur character that we just saw in Gwen and Dave? What if we wanted to bring him in as a 3D element directly into Smoke and manipulate it? Well, we can do that too. Now, the big advantage in working this way is that we can bring the 3D assets directly into Smoke and not have to and fro between 3D to make changes. There's a lot that I can do directly in Smoke without having to hand it back to be revised. So this is an example of a little piece that we put together. A little broadcast promo piece. The 3D text was created directly in Smoke. So this is the animated character that came from Maya, actually, this time, as an FBX with its skin textures, its eyeball textures, a bump map for the skin, and of course some textures for the 3D text. So when we go into Smoke, this is what it looks like. So if we just drag through the time bar, you can see there he actually does all these animation. Now what I've done inside Action is I've got two cameras. I've added a second one here that's a close-up camera, just so that I don't mess around with the original camera data. I'm going to use this to see the Dave character in more detail. Now I want to draw your attention at the moment to his skin texture. So if we go down to his the normals map and actually play around with the depth of that, I can increase it or decrease it. I can even make it go negative. The big advantage with this is that I can then play around with my lighting in Smoke and real shadows, and you can see that the texture actually behaves faithfully as to what would happen with the lighting. So I've got control over his eyes even. Whatever the 3D artist gives me control over, I can manipulate that directly down in the timeline. So I'm animating his eyeballs because once he sits down, he freezes, and I'd like something to move. So the eyeballs wandering around is a fairly easy thing to do. So I've just keyframed that a couple of times. So that's now animated. Now I don't need that second camera, so I'm just going to throw it away. The next thing I'd like to deal with is, once I'm happy with the animation, that looks pretty good and his eyes are doing what I intended, let's bring in enhance the lighting. So we've got some volumetric rays here to make it a bit more theatrical, and we've got full control over the color of that and the positioning, and it really is a 3D volumetric light being cast. The other thing is the text. So let's just bring that text in that we had before with my stone textures attached. So I've got one texture on the front and a different one on the sides, as you can see there. And of course they've got their own bump map as well, so that they react according to the highlights and shadows being cast, and even casting their own shadows over the animated Dave character, all in 3D space. So there's our animation. If we just play through that, you can see there's my finished spot. So let's say we need to do some versioning of this. So what I'd like to do is go into my text node here and just change the words. It's just a matter of retyping it. And voila, there it is. And just reposition it slightly. And of course, all the shadow casting is completely accurate. And it's a matter of then going back to the timeline and just re-rendering that. Now, I've just made another version here with a reflection in the floor to show you how that was done. We do not have ray tracing. However, there is a technique that we use that's extremely efficient at giving exactly that same look. All I did was took a pass of the text, flipped it, and blended it in as a screen on the floor. And the simplest solution is often the best. And there's our final result. Just play that back. All done in a matter of minutes. So there's an overview of just some of the many capabilities of Smoke 2013, the all-in-one solution for editors who want to do more than just edit.